Trump put a 25% tariff on the one resource American farmers cannot plant a single acre without. Within 72 hours, his own agriculture secretary was publicly scrambling to walk it back. Here is what the headlines missed about what happens when you try to use Canada as a pressure point on potash, and why this move quietly became one of the most consequential miscalculations in modern American agricultural policy. Before we go any further, drop a comment below. Do you think Trump's tariff strategy on Canada was smart leverage, or did it blow up in America's face? Let's get into it. Here is a number that should stop every American cold. 94%. That is the share of its potash that the United States imports. The country that feeds the world, the single largest agricultural economy on the planet, produces less than 6% of a mineral that is utterly foundational to growing food at scale. Corn, soybeans, wheat, cotton, none of it grows efficiently without potassium. And potassium comes from potash. There is no workaround and no substitute. The U.S. Geological Survey confirmed it in plain language. No substitute exists for potassium as an essential plant nutrient. Full stop. Now here is where it gets even more uncomfortable. Of that vast import dependency, the U.S. gets roughly 87% of its annual potash volume from Canada, with between 7 and 9% coming from Russia. Specifically, it comes from Saskatchewan. One Canadian province is effectively underwriting the fertilizer supply of the most powerful agricultural nation on Earth. Canada's total potash reserves sit at 1.1 billion tons, 5 times larger than U.S. reserves. And in terms of actual mining output, Canada's production volume in 2024 was 36 times larger than the United States. Let that land for a moment. 36 times. This is not a minor trade dependency. It is a structural vulnerability that has been quietly accumulating for decades, sitting beneath every American farm, every grocery store shelf, and every food price you have paid at checkout. Enter Donald Trump. On March 4, 2025, the Trump administration imposed sweeping 25% tariffs on Canadian and Mexican imports, citing border security and fentanyl trafficking under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. The move was designed as classic pressure. Hit Canada hard, force concessions, win the negotiation. Except someone apparently failed to check what was actually on the tariff list. Potash was in there. A 25% levy on the mineral that American farmers depend on for their entire growing season, and not just incidentally. The tariff covered potash falling outside CUSMA trade agreement protections, meaning a meaningful slice of the supply chain was staring down a massive cost increase right at the start of planting season. The reaction from the American farm lobby was immediate, and it was loud. Senator Chuck Grassley of Iowa, a Republican core Trump base, wrote publicly to the president, "I plead with President Trump to exempt potash from the tariff because family farmers get most of our potash from Canada." The American Soybean Association flagged the economic threat directly. Farming groups across the Midwest started running the numbers, and the numbers were ugly. Here is why. According to USDA data, fertilizer accounts for 33% to 44% of costs for corn production alone. That is not a rounding error. That is nearly half of everything a farmer spends in a year. When you suddenly add a 25% tariff on top of the primary fertilizer input, you are not hurting Canada. Canada simply redirects its exports to Brazil, China, and Southeast Asia, markets that have been rapidly expanding their appetite for Canadian supply for years, and are fully positioned to absorb the volume. What you are doing is directly raising the cost of production for American farmers who have no equivalent alternative to turn to. The president of the Michigan Farmers Union put it plainly. We have no way of recouping that cost typically because crops are sold at the whim of whatever the market is, rather than allowing us to set our own price. An Iowa farmer cannot walk up to the Chicago Board of Trade and demand a higher price per bushel because his input costs rose. The market does not care. The cost increase stays on the farmer's balance sheet. So, what happened next? Within days of the tariff announcement, the Trump administration was already quietly retreating specifically on potash. By March 6, 2025, the White House had issued a new fact sheet confirming potash not covered under CUSMA would face a reduced rate of 10%, not 25%. Agriculture Secretary Brooke Rollins stepped in front of cameras and described fertilizer input cost inflation as skyrocketing, framing the tariff reduction as a critical step in helping farmers manage key input costs at the height of planting season. Read that again. The Trump administration imposed the tariff, then within days the Agriculture Secretary was announcing a reduction of that same tariff as though it were a policy achievement. That is not leverage. That is a miscalculation wrapped in a press release. But even at 10%, the damage had already started. Industry economists were warning that the reduced tariff would still feed into higher fall potash prices. The market had already reacted. Uncertainty had entered the system, and American farmers, sitting in the most expensive stretch of their year, were already revising their financial projections downward. This is only where the story starts, because after the 10% tariff failed to fix anything, Trump did not step back. He leaned in harder. In December 2025, he threatened what he called very severe tariffs on Canadian fertilizer imports, and said from the Oval Office, on the record, "You'll be making your own fertilizer very soon." Will America? Can America? And if not Canada, then where exactly does Trump think this potash is going to come from? The answer involves a sanctioned dictatorship, a roughly $20,000 shipping route, and a financial reality that even the White House could not fully ignore. On December 13, 2025, the Trump administration made a move that barely registered in mainstream coverage. U.S. Special Envoy John Cole flew to Minsk, sat down with Alexander Lukashenko, one of Europe's most entrenched authoritarian leaders, and announced the lifting of U.S. sanctions on Belarus's potash sector. In exchange, Lukashenko pardoned 123 political prisoners, including Nobel Peace Prize laureate Ales Bialyatsky and opposition leader Maria Kolesnikova. Let's be clear about what this was from a pure strategic standpoint. The White House needed a backup supply narrative for potash. It needed to be able to tell American farmers and agribusiness, we have other options. So the administration turned to Belarus. Pause on that for a second. Belarus is a close ally of Russia that allowed Moscow to use its territory to launch the 2022 invasion of Ukraine. It is a country where EU sanctions are still fully in place and being expanded. That is the alternative supply chain Trump was constructing. And here is the financial reality that deal ran straight into. Belarus is approximately 20,000 kilometers from the American Midwest by sea and land route. Canada shares a border with the United States. That single sentence is the entire economic argument. Canadian potash from Saskatchewan travels by rail directly into U.S. distribution hubs across the Midwest, the most cost-efficient supply chain in global potash trade. The infrastructure already exists. The contracts are already in place. The rail lines run straight into America's agricultural heartland. Nutrien, the world's largest potash producer headquartered in Canada, has confirmed that its supply crosses the U.S. border without tariff burden under CUSMA. Now contrast that with Belarus. Belarusian potash lost access to Baltic port facilities after Lithuania terminated the transit contract in 2022, following Belarus's role in the Ukraine invasion. So Belarusian exports now move through Russian ports, are loaded onto ocean-going vessels, shipped across the Atlantic, offloaded at American coastal ports, and then transported by rail or truck hundreds of miles inland to reach the Midwest farms that actually need the product. The cost differential is not marginal. Josh Linville, vice president of fertilizer at StoneX Group, made the point directly. The problem is that if you start to upset Canada, there is almost nowhere else in the world to realistically turn. As he explained it, you could see Belarusian potash fall in commodity price and still pay more per ton delivered to an Iowa farm because the logistics costs eat the savings. That is not a trade win. That is a cost transfer, and the American farmer absorbs every dollar of it. Belarus, despite years of sanctions, had already rebuilt its export volumes through alternative routes, primarily to China and India. That means when the US lifted sanctions and theoretically opened an American market for Belarusian potash, Belarus did not suddenly have a surplus sitting in a warehouse ready to ship west. Analysts at S&P Global Energy flagged the point. If Belarus ships more to the US, it ships less somewhere else. Global balances barely shift. The Belarus deal gives Trump a talking point. It does not give American farmers a functional replacement for Canadian supply. The EU sanctions also remain fully in place, and that matters enormously because European financial institutions, major shipping companies, and maritime insurance providers still treat Belarusian cargo as elevated risk. Lifting U.S. sanctions simplifies paperwork. It does not unclog the physical logistics reality. While all of this geopolitical maneuvering was playing out, the financial damage to American agriculture was already being measured in hard data. The U.S. Import Price Index for chemical fertilizers climbed from 164.5 in December 2024 to 186.5 by September 2025, a 13% increase in under a year. The U.S. prices paid index tracking actual farmer input costs rose to 149.9 in June 2025, up from 139.9 the prior year. Fertilizer was identified as the primary driver, up 11% within that single tracking period. Fertilizer already accounts for between a third and nearly half of corn production costs, and these farmers are selling into commodity markets. They cannot raise the price they receive per bushel. It compresses margins. On thin margin operations, it pushes farms into the red. The tariff did not hurt Canada. Canada's potash producers deepened ties with Brazil, China, and Southeast Asian markets, which have been growing their appetite for Canadian supply for years and are well positioned to absorb the volume. The financial blow landed in Iowa, Kansas, Nebraska, and Illinois. So now here is where the story reaches its sharpest point, because if the Belarus plan has structural limits, and it clearly does, and if Canada is still the only realistic large-scale supplier, what exactly is Trump's domestic solution? Because he announced one, loudly. He said America would build its own potash, and there actually is a plan for that. A government-backed plan in Michigan, to be exact. But when you look at the timeline and the numbers, the domestic solution does not arrive in time to help any farmer currently putting seed in the ground. Not this year, not next year. Possibly not this decade at the scale America actually needs. The Michigan Potash and Salt Company project in Osceola County is real. The U.S. Department of Energy issued a conditional loan guarantee of up to $1.26 billion to help finance construction of a facility in Evart, Michigan. Trump's administration fast-tracked it through executive orders on critical minerals. The project has government backing, political support, and genuine resource underground. The U.S. Geological Survey confirmed the area holds one of the purest known potash deposits on Earth, roughly 7,800 feet below the surface. Valued at an estimated $65 billion on paper, it sounds like the answer. Here is the reality check. The facility is planned to initially produce roughly 800,000 tons of potash annually, with construction expected to take 36 months. Earliest realistic production, 2028. Michigan Potash's own materials state plainly that this facility will supply roughly 10% of U.S. demand. 10%. The United States consumes approximately 12 million tons of potash per year. One domestic mine, after more than $1 billion in government financing, covers 1/10 of national need, and it is not producing yet. The permitting process alone carries an estimated completion date running into late 2026. Construction then takes 3 years from that point. The company was originally targeting production in 2014, then 2022, then 2024, now 2028, and the CEO himself acknowledged he cannot give a firm start date for construction beyond as soon as possible. That is not a criticism of the people involved. Building a potash mine is genuinely complex, but the average life cycle from discovery to production in this sector is 28 years. Trump said in December 2025 that America would be making its own fertilizer very soon. The data says otherwise. The farmer planting corn in Iowa in 2026 is not getting potash from Michigan. The farmer planting soybeans in Illinois this season is not getting potash from Michigan. They are getting it from Saskatchewan, same as they always have. Here is the sharpest financial irony in this entire episode. While the Trump administration was threatening Canada with tariffs, building the case for domestic production, and negotiating with Belarus for leverage, the single largest expansion of global potash supply anywhere on the planet is being built in Saskatchewan, Canada. BHP, the world's largest mining company, has invested between $7 and $7.4 billion into the Jansen potash mine, located roughly 140 kilometers east of Saskatoon. Jansen Stage 1 is 73% complete and on track for first production in mid-2027, ramping to 4.15 million tons of annual capacity. Stage 2 is already 13% complete, targeting an additional 4.36 million tons per year by 2031. At full build-out, Jansen alone reaches 8.51 million tons per year, roughly 10% of the entire global potash supply coming from one mine in one Canadian province. BHP has also confirmed the potential for 2 further expansions that could push total Jansen capacity to 16-17 million tons per year. Let that sink in terms of the financial strategy at play. The country Trump was threatening, tariffing, and attempting to replace as a potash supplier is simultaneously building the largest new potash mine on the planet. Canada is not retreating from this market. Canada is doubling down, attracting billions in private capital, and positioning itself to supply the world, including almost certainly the United States, with more potash than ever before. The leverage calculation the White House built its strategy around is running entirely in reverse. Let's bring this home to where it belongs: the American wallet. The Trump tariff strategy on Canada did not weaken Canada's position in potash. It raised costs for American agriculture, which flowed into the broader economy. The U.S. Import Price Index for chemical fertilizers climbed 13% in under a year. The U.S. prices paid index tracking actual farmer input costs rose 11% in a single period. Fertilizer was the primary driver. Those costs do not stop at the farm gate. They move through the supply chain, into the price of corn, which feeds livestock and ends up as meat, into the price of wheat, which ends up as bread, into every processed food product built on commodity crop inputs. Canada, meanwhile, accelerated its export diversification and deepened ties with Brazil, India, China, and Southeast Asian markets hungry for supply. Mosaic's recent decision to sell off its American mine signals how confident the industry is about the ongoing profitability of exporting Saskatchewan potash south of the border. Nutrien did not panic. It planned. The global potash market is heading towards supply tightness through the late 2020s, driven by rising food demand and shrinking arable land per capita. Canada's 1.1 billion tons of reserves, 5 times larger than U.S. reserves, only become more strategically valuable over time, not less. Here is the clean financial summary of what this episode tells us. Trump put tariffs on a commodity with no substitutes. His own agriculture secretary reversed course within days. The Belarus alternative carries logistics costs that erase any pricing advantage on delivery. The domestic production plan will not cover more than 10% of U.S. demand, years from now at best. And Canada is currently constructing the world's largest new potash mine, not because of anything Trump did, but because global food demand makes it one of the best capital deployments on Earth. The potash play was not leverage. It was a miscalculation that exposed a structural dependency that decades of American trade policy and agricultural strategy had quietly ignored. When you import 94% of a critical mineral and the country you import it from holds 5 times your reserves and is actively expanding production, a trade war is not a negotiating tool. It is a cost increase pointed directly at your own farmers. Canada held the cards before this started. It holds them now. And in 2027, when Jansen opens in Saskatchewan and begins ramping toward over 8 million tons of annual capacity, it will hold even more of them. That is the full picture. From the March 2025 tariff announcement, through the Belarus deal in December, through the domestic production gaps, all the way to what it means for American food prices and farm economics in 2026 and beyond.